Cloud rain hammered against the studio windows as Felix froze in the doorway, his hand still wrapped around the cold metal handle. Impossible, a voice laughed. And then Hyunjin laughed too, not the polite laugh he gave strangers, not the soft chuckle he offered during interviews. It was a real laugh, bright, careless, genuine, the kind Felix hadn't heard in weeks. The sound hit harder than any insult ever could. For a second he couldn't move. Inside the practice room, Hyunjin sat on the floor beside a young photographer who had been following their latest project. They were looking through pictures on a camera screen, shoulders almost touching. Hyunjin's eyes sparkled. His smile was effortless. And Felix suddenly felt like he couldn't breathe. The tightness in his chest arrived without warning, sharp, unwelcome, terrifying. He quietly stepped back before either of them noticed him. The hallway outside was empty except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the faint scent of rain drifting through a cracked window. Felix leaned against the wall. His fingers trembled. He hated that they trembled. "What is wrong with me?" he whispered. The question echoed in the silence. For years, Felix had convinced himself that what he felt for Hyunjin was simple friendship. Nothing more, nothing dangerous, nothing that could destroy everything. Yet lately, every smile Hyunjin gave someone else felt like a knife twisting deeper beneath his ribs. Every conversation, every touch, every glance. Felix closed his eyes. He remembered 100 moments he should have forgotten. Hyunjin falling asleep on his shoulder during a flight. Hyunjin texting him at 3 in the morning because he couldn't sleep. Hyunjin buying him coffee without asking because he already knew Felix's order. Tiny moments, meaningless moments, moments that somehow became everything. The studio door suddenly opened. Felix straightened immediately. Hyunjin stepped into the hallway. His smile faded when he saw him. "Felix. Hey, okay?" Felix forced a grin, the same grin he used whenever something hurt, the same grin nobody ever questioned, of course. Hyunjin stared at him too long, too carefully. It was one of the things Felix both loved and feared about him. Hyunjin noticed everything. "You don't look okay. I'm tired." "You barely slept again." Felix laughed softly. "Look who's talking." For a brief moment the familiar rhythm returned, the easy comfort, the invisible thread that always connected them. Then the photographer appeared behind Hyunjin. "Oh, there you are," she said cheerfully. Felix felt that painful pressure return to his chest. Hyunjin turned toward her. The smile came back instantly. And Felix hated himself for noticing. The rest of the evening passed like a blur, meetings, schedules, rehearsals, conversations he barely heard. Every time Felix looked up, he saw Hyunjin laughing, smiling, talking, living, and every time that ache grew worse. By midnight, rain still covered the city. The roads reflected thousands of neon lights. Felix found himself sitting alone on the rooftop of their building. The concrete was cold beneath him. The wind carried the scent of wet asphalt and distant traffic. Usually the rooftop helped him think. Tonight it only made him feel more lost. "What are you doing out here?" Felix didn't need to turn around. He knew the voice instantly. Hyunjin, of course. He always found him. Hyunjin sat beside him. Neither spoke for several seconds. The city stretched endlessly below, a sea of lights under a dark sky. Finally Hyunjin sighed. "Been avoiding me." Felix looked away. "No, you have. No, you really want to argue with me, despite everything." Felix laughed, a real laugh, small, broken, but real. Hyunjin smiled softly. "There he is." Warmth in his voice hurt more than it should have. Felix swallowed hard. His emotions felt dangerously close to the surface, too close. "What happened today?" Hyunjin asked quietly. "Nothing." "Felix." The way Hyunjin said his name always sounded different, gentler, softer, like something precious. Felix hated that he noticed, hated that it mattered, because it wasn't supposed to matter. Friends weren't supposed to feel this way. Friends weren't supposed to spend sleepless nights wondering if someone else's smile belonged to them. Friends weren't supposed to feel jealous. The word itself made him sick, jealous, possessive, selfish, wrong. The rain began falling again, gentle drops at first, then heavier. Neither moved. Water soaked through their clothes. Still they stayed. Hyunjin stared at the skyline. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes I feel like you're drifting away from me." Felix's heart stopped. The confession was so unexpected he forgot how to respond. Hyunjin laughed sadly. "Look." "What look?" "The look you get when you're hiding something." Felix lowered his gaze. If only Hyunjin knew, if only he understood. The truth sat between them like a loaded weapon. One sentence could destroy everything. One confession could change their lives forever. So Felix remained silent, because silence was safer, silence hurt less. Or at least that's what he kept telling himself. The rain soaked his hair. Cold water ran down his face. Hyunjin suddenly removed his jacket and held it above both of them. The gesture was ridiculous. The jacket was far too small to block the rain, yet somehow it made Felix smile. "What are you doing? Trying to save us from drowning? We're already soaked." Details. Felix laughed again. And for one beautiful moment the pain disappeared, just for a second, just long enough to remember why he fell for him in the first place. Hyunjin wasn't perfect, he was stubborn, dramatic. Possible sometimes, but he was kind and warm, and he always stayed when everyone else left. The rain eventually slowed, the city became quieter. Hyunjin stood. "We should go inside." Yeah. Neither moved immediately. Something lingered in the air, something unspoken, something fragile. Then Hyunjin offered his hand. Felix stared at it, the familiar hand he had held countless times. Yet tonight it felt different, dangerous, beautiful. He reached out anyway, their fingers touched. A simple contact, nothing unusual. Nothing special. But Felix felt his heartbeat stumble. Hyunjin pulled him up effortlessly. For a brief second they stood closer than necessary, close enough to hear each other's breathing, close enough to see raindrops clinging to eyelashes, close enough to imagine impossible things. Then reality returned, and the distance came back. Together they walked toward the rooftop door, toward warmth, toward light, toward another day of pretending. Felix followed a step behind. His chest still ached. The jealousy hadn't vanished. Neither had the fear. But as he watched Hyunjin hold the door open and wait for him, a small realization settled quietly inside him. The pain wasn't coming from seeing Hyunjin happy with someone else. The pain came from knowing he wanted to be the reason for that happiness. And for the first time, Felix wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending otherwise. The following morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and lingering rain. Felix barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hyunjin smile, not the smile from the rooftop, the one from the practice room, the one he had shared with someone else. By the time the alarm rang, exhaustion had settled deep inside his bones. The dorm felt unusually quiet. Most of the members had already left for an early schedule. Felix sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the rain crawling down the window glass. The city beyond looked blurred and distant, almost unreal. His phone vibrated. A message appeared. "Hyunjin, are you awake?" Felix stared at the screen. A second message arrived. "Hyunjin, don't skip breakfast again." Despite everything, a small smile appeared. It was ridiculous. One text, just one simple text. And suddenly the world felt a little lighter. Felix typed a response. "Felix, I'm awake." 3 dots appeared instantly. "Hyunjin, good. Hyunjin, meet me downstairs." Felix frowned. "Felix, why?" A few seconds passed. Then another message. "Hyunjin, because I bought too much coffee." Felix knew that was a lie. Hyunjin never bought too much coffee, not once. Yet 20 minutes later, Felix found himself standing outside a small cafe near the company building. Rain tapped softly against the awning. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air. And there was Hyunjin, waiting, just as he promised. A warm paper cup rested in each hand. "You look terrible," Hyunjin announced immediately. Felix rolled his eyes. "Good morning to you too. You didn't sleep. You don't know that. You have the same face you had during that 20-hour flight." Felix groaned. Hyunjin laughed. The sound was familiar now, comforting, dangerous. They began walking toward the company building together. For a while neither spoke. The rain created a soft rhythm around them. Cars passed. People hurried beneath umbrellas. Life continued as normal. Only Felix felt different, like something inside him had shifted. Like he was standing at the edge of a cliff he couldn't see. "Been quiet lately." Hyunjin's voice broke the silence. Felix stared ahead, always quiet. "No," Hyunjin shook his head, pretending. Felix glanced at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you're smiling when you're unhappy." The words landed harder than expected. Hyunjin continued walking. His eyes remained fixed on the street ahead. "Know your real smile." Felix's chest tightened. Of course he did. After all these years, Hyunjin probably knew him better than anyone. That was the problem. He knew everything, everything except the one thing that mattered most. They arrived at the company building. The moment they stepped inside, chaos greeted them. Managers rushed through hallways, staff members carried equipment, phones rang continuously, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. A new project was beginning. And with it came endless schedules. Felix welcomed the distraction. Work was easier than feelings. Practice was easier than honesty. For several hours he managed to lose himself completely, dance rehearsals, meetings, recording sessions. The familiar routine pushed unwanted thoughts aside, at least temporarily. Then lunchtime arrived, and everything fell apart again. Felix entered the cafeteria carrying a tray. The room buzzed with conversation. Laughter echoed from every corner. His eyes automatically searched for Hyunjin. He found him immediately. Of course he did. Hyunjin sat at a table near the window. And sitting beside him was the photographer again. They were looking through images on a tablet, talking animatedly, smiling. Something twisted painfully inside Felix. The reaction was immediate, instinctive. He hated it. The worst part was knowing how unreasonable it was. Hyunjin wasn't doing anything wrong. He was allowed to have friends, allowed to laugh, allowed to spend time with whoever he wanted. So why did it feel like losing something? Felix turned away. He chose a different table far away. Far enough not to hear their conversation, far enough not to watch, or at least that was the plan. Unfortunately, his eyes kept drifting back again and again and again. At one point, Hyunjin threw his head back laughing. The photographer laughed too. The sight felt like a punch. Felix immediately looked down at his food. His appetite disappeared. A few minutes later, someone dropped into the seat across from him. Felix looked up. Hyunjin, of course. The photographer remained at the other table. Now speaking with several staff members, Hyunjin leaned forward. "Why are you sitting over here?" Felix nearly choked on his drink. "What? You usually sit with us." "I wanted some quiet." Hyunjin narrowed his eyes. That look again, the one that suggested he was investigating something, the one Felix could never escape. Lying, eating. "You're avoiding me." Felix laughed nervously. "No." Argument continued for several seconds until Hyunjin suddenly smiled, a genuine smile, soft, affectionate, the kind that made Felix's heart forget how to function. "There you are." Felix blinked. "What? You've looked sad all day." Concern in Hyunjin's voice felt dangerously sincere. For a brief moment, Felix wanted to tell him everything, every secret, every sleepless night, every jealous thought, every impossible feeling. He wanted to place the truth between them and finally stop carrying it alone. But fear arrived immediately afterward, fear of losing him, fear of changing everything. Fear of hearing words he could never recover from, so he swallowed the confession before it could escape. "I'm fine." Hyunjin looked unconvinced, but he nodded anyway. The afternoon passed slowly. By evening, the rain had finally stopped. The sky glowed orange and purple beyond the city skyline. Most employees had already gone home. The building felt emptier, quieter. Felix finished practice later than expected. His muscles ached. His mind felt exhausted. As he walked toward the exit, he heard music drifting from one of the smaller studios. Curious, he paused. The door was slightly open. Inside, someone was dancing alone. Hyunjin, the room was dimly lit. Only a few overhead lights remained on. Music filled the empty space. Hyunjin moved effortlessly. Every motion carried emotion, grace, loneliness, longing. Felix stood silently in the doorway, watching, forgetting to breathe. The dance wasn't perfect. That was what made it beautiful. It felt honest, raw. Like watching someone's heart speak without words. Eventually the music ended. Hyunjin stopped moving. His chest rose and fell rapidly. For several seconds he remained perfectly still. Then he spoke without turning around. "Long have you been standing there?" Felix smiled, busted. Hyunjin laughed quietly. "I could feel you starring." Felix stepped inside. The studio suddenly felt smaller, warmer, more intimate. Neither seemed eager to leave. Outside, darkness settled over the city. Inside, only silence remained. Comfortable silence. The kind they had shared for years. Then Hyunjin sat on the floor. Felix joined him. For a while they simply rested, listening to distant sounds from the building. Finally Hyunjin spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Felix nodded. "Sure." Hyunjin hesitated, an unusual thing for him. Then he looked directly into Felix's eyes, a serious expression replacing his usual smile. "Have you ever cared about someone so much that it scared you?" The question struck like lightning. Felix froze. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. For a moment he forgot how to answer, forgot how to breathe. because the truth was simple, yes, every single day. And the person sitting beside him was the reason why.
Felix's pulse pounded so loudly that he was afraid Hyunjin might hear it. The question lingered between them, simple, dangerous, honest. The studio suddenly felt too quiet, too small, too warm. Hyunjin waited patiently, resting his arms on his knees. For once, there was no teasing in his expression, no playful smile, only sincerity. Felix lowered his gaze. "Yeah," he finally answered. The word came out softer than intended. Hyunjin didn't look away. What was it like? Felix swallowed. How was he supposed to answer that? How could he explain a feeling that had slowly taken over every corner of his life? A feeling that sat right beside him at this very moment. It was. He searched for the right words. Confusing, Hyunjin nodded slowly. Because you didn't know how they felt, Felix laughed quietly. There was that. And Felix stared at the polished floor. The reflection of the ceiling lights shimmered faintly across its surface. And because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Losing them. Answer escaped before he could stop it. Silence followed. A heavy silence, not uncomfortable, just real. Hyunjin looked away first, his expression softened. I understand that. Felix's heart skipped. You do? More than you think. For a moment neither spoke. The city lights flickered beyond the studio windows. Cars moved like streams of gold and white beneath the dark sky. Life continued outside. Inside, everything felt suspended. Eventually, Hyunjin stood. He stretched his arms above his head and smiled. A smaller smile than usual, almost thoughtful. We should go home. Felix nodded. Yeah. Walk back to the dorm was unusually peaceful. The rain had stopped completely. The air smelled fresh. Streetlights reflected on damp pavement. They walked side by side, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. Neither seemed eager to fill the silence. Sometimes words weren't necessary. At least that was what Felix told himself. Yet his mind kept returning to Hyunjin's question. Have you ever cared about someone so much that it scared you? The answer felt painfully obvious. What he didn't understand was why Hyunjin had asked it. The thought stayed with him throughout the evening, and it stayed with him long after everyone else had fallen asleep. The next few days passed quickly. Schedules became busier. Practices grew longer. Interviews filled entire afternoons. The constant movement should have distracted Felix. Instead, it only made him more aware of Hyunjin. Because no matter how crowded the room became, his attention always found him. A laugh across the hallway, a familiar voice during rehearsal, a smile from the other side of a crowded room. It was exhausting, and wonderful, and terrifying. One afternoon, the group traveled to a nearby city for a promotional event. The venue overlooked the ocean. Large windows framed endless waves beneath a cloudy sky. Fans gathered outside hours before the event began. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Backstage, however, everything felt chaotic. Managers hurried between rooms, staff members checked equipment, performers rehearsed final details. Felix sat quietly in a corner reviewing notes when he overheard two staff members talking nearby. Did you hear? Hear what? Hyunjin's been spending a lot of time with that photographer lately. Felix immediately wished he hadn't listened. The conversation continued anyway. They seem close. Really? That's what everyone's saying. Something cold settled in his stomach. He looked away, forced himself to focus on the papers in his hands. But the words remained. They seemed close. The rest of the afternoon became a blur. By the time the event ended, Felix felt drained, not physically, emotionally. The crowd's cheers echoed in his ears as they returned to the hotel later that night. Most of the members gathered in the lounge area. Some played games, others watched television. Laughter filled the room. Felix quietly slipped away. He wasn't in the mood for company. The hotel balcony overlooked the ocean. Dark waves rolled beneath the moonlight. The wind carried the scent of salt and rain. Felix leaned against the railing. The cool metal felt grounding. For the first time all day, he could think, or at least try to. The balcony door opened behind him. He didn't need to turn around. He already knew. Hyunjin found you. Felix smiled weakly. You always do. Hyunjin stepped beside him. The ocean stretched endlessly before them. Silver moonlight danced across the water. For several moments neither spoke. Then Hyunjin sighed. Something's bothering you. Felix laughed quietly. You really don't give up. Answer came immediately, certain, unwavering. Felix looked at him. Hyunjin was staring at the horizon. The moonlight softened his features, made him look almost unreal. You know, Hyunjin said softly, I don't like it when you keep things to yourself. Felix's chest tightened. What if I don't know how to talk about them? Hyunjin considered that. Then he smiled. A gentle smile, one meant only for him. Then start small. Wind swept across the balcony. Below them, waves crashed against the shore. Felix closed his eyes briefly. Maybe he was tired of hiding. Maybe he was tired of pretending everything was fine. Or maybe he was simply tired of carrying this alone. When he opened his eyes again, his voice sounded quieter than usual. I heard people talking today. Hyunjin turned toward him. What? Felix hesitated, then forced the words out. And the photographer. For a second, Hyunjin looked surprised, then he blinked and laughed, actually laughed. Felix stared. What? Hyunjin shook his head. That's what's been bothering you. Felix immediately regretted saying anything. Forget it. Hyunjin's smile faded slightly. Felix. Seriousness in his voice stopped him. We're working on a project together. That's all. That's all. Relief arrived so suddenly it almost made Felix dizzy. And that realization frightened him, because nobody should feel that relieved. Not over something like this, not unless. He immediately cut the thought short, but it was too late. The truth had been growing inside him for too long, too large to ignore, too real to deny. Hyunjin studied him carefully, as if trying to solve a puzzle, as if searching for an answer hidden beneath the surface. Then, unexpectedly, he took a step closer. The distance between them shrank, not enough to draw attention, just enough to make Felix's heartbeat stumble. You know something? Hyunjin asked quietly. What? I think you're scared too. Felix froze, the ocean roared below, the wind moved through their hair, everything else faded away. Only Hyunjin's voice remained, only those words. I think you're scared too. And for the first time, Felix wondered if Hyunjin was beginning to see the truth that he had spent so long trying to hide. Felix couldn't look away. The wind swept across the balcony, carrying the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly into the darkness, but Felix barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the person standing in front of him, Hyunjin, and the look in his eyes. I think you're scared too. Words echoed in Felix's mind. Scared. The truth was that scared wasn't a strong enough word. He was terrified of being rejected, terrified of ruining the friendship that had become one of the most important parts of his life, terrified that if he ever said what was truly in his heart, everything would change. And yet, standing here now, he was becoming equally terrified of never saying it at all. Hyunjin rested his elbows on the balcony railing. His expression had softened. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. Felix let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you. A small smile appeared on Hyunjin's face. But someday you should. Felix's heart tightened. The way Hyunjin said it felt different, not like pressure, not like curiosity, almost like hope. The thought lingered long after they returned inside. The following week became one of the busiest they had experienced in months. Schedules started before sunrise and often ended after midnight. The constant activity should have exhausted Felix. Instead, it gave him too much time to think, because once he noticed it, he couldn't stop noticing. The way Hyunjin always searched for him first in crowded rooms. The way he instinctively sat beside him whenever there was an empty seat. The way his mood seemed to brighten whenever Felix laughed. Tiny things, small things, things that could mean everything or nothing. And that uncertainty was driving him crazy. One evening after practice, most of the members left early. Only Felix and Hyunjin remained. The dance studio was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Felix sat on the floor stretching sore muscles. Across the room, Hyunjin was sketching in a notebook, one of his favorite habits. Whenever his thoughts became too loud, he drew. Felix had always admired that, the ability to transform emotions into art. After several minutes, Hyunjin suddenly closed the notebook. What? Felix blinked. What? You've been staring at me. Felix immediately looked away. Have not. You absolutely have. Felix groaned. Hyunjin laughed. The familiar sound filled the room warm and bright. Impossible, Felix muttered. So I've been told. Hyunjin stood and walked over. Before Felix could react, Hyunjin dropped onto the floor beside him, close, very close. Felix suddenly found the opposite wall fascinating. Can I ask you something? Hyunjin said. Felix hesitated. Depends. Do you trust me? The question arrived without warning. Felix turned toward him. Hyunjin wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was serious, honest, vulnerable, and somehow that made the question feel much bigger than it should have. Of course I trust you. Answer came immediately, without hesitation. Without doubt. Hyunjin held his gaze for several seconds, then nodded slowly. I trust you too. Something shifted inside Felix. A quiet ache, a dangerous hope. Neither spoke for a while afterward. The silence wasn't awkward, it never was between them. Eventually, Hyunjin opened his notebook again. Felix glanced down. A drawing filled the page. It showed a person standing beneath rain. The details were beautiful, delicate, emotional. The figure looked lonely somehow, lost. Felix studied it carefully. "Who's that?" Hyunjin froze just for a second, then he looked down at the sketch. No one. Felix raised an eyebrow. Liar. A reluctant smile appeared. Maybe. Answer only increased Felix's curiosity. Then who? Hyunjin remained silent. The studio lights reflected softly in his eyes. For a brief moment he looked uncertain, as if debating something internally. Finally he spoke. Someone important. Felix's stomach dropped. The reaction was immediate, painfully immediate. He hated that. Hated how much those words affected him. Someone important. The phrase echoed through his mind. Before he could stop himself, he asked, "Do I know them?" Hyunjin looked at him directly, intently, long enough that Felix forgot to breathe. "Yes." Answer was barely above a whisper. A strange warmth spread through Felix's chest, followed immediately by nervousness. Questions crowded his thoughts, thousands of them, but none felt safe enough to ask. The atmosphere between them had changed, subtly, yet undeniably. Like standing at the edge of something neither of them fully understood. Eventually, Hyunjin closed the notebook. The moment passed, or perhaps it only hid itself. Later that night, back at the dorm, sleep once again refused to come. Felix lay awake staring at the ceiling. The city lights filtered through the curtains, everything was quiet, yet his mind refused to rest. Someone important. Do I know them? Yes. The conversation replayed endlessly. Around 2 a.m, he finally gave up trying to sleep. Walked quietly toward the kitchen. The dorm was dark, silent, peaceful. As he entered the kitchen, he froze. Someone was already there, Hyunjin, standing by the window, a mug of tea in his hands. Moonlight illuminated his profile. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Hyunjin smiled, a sleepy smile, a real one. "Can't sleep," Felix laughed softly. "Either," Hyunjin shook his head. "No." Answer carried a familiar sadness. Felix walked over and stood beside him. Outside, the city slept beneath a blanket of lights. For several moments, they simply watched the view. Then Hyunjin spoke, quietly, almost absent-mindedly. "You ever wonder what would happen if we stopped hiding things?" Felix's heart nearly stopped. The question felt too specific, too dangerous. Slowly, he turned toward him. Hyunjin was still looking out the window. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, his expression unreadable. And suddenly Felix realized something. For months he had assumed he was the only one struggling, the only one carrying secrets, the only one afraid. But what if he was wrong? The possibility settled into his chest like a spark, small, fragile, yet impossible to ignore. For the first time, Felix began to wonder whether the distance between them existed because both of them were afraid to cross it.